Our Open Book, Open Mind series is funded through the generosity of the Montclair Public Library Foundation through its donors, as well as through grants from the Montclair Foundation and Investors Foundation.
So I think we're going to start with a passage, if you would do that for us.
First of all, Jonathan Alter, thank you very much for that. That's just the perfect way to start this for me. And John and I professionally, as he said, first interacted when I was working for Senator Moynihan. And as some of you might know, Senator Moynihan was a former Harvard professor who became a United States Senator. In fact, he intended, his plan was, because he didn't want to give up tenure, because he grew up a poor kid in Hell's Kitchen and he couldn't believe that he had tenure. He had a job where he couldn't be fired. So he didn't want to give up tenure at Harvard. His plan was to actually continue to teach at Harvard one day a week while working in the Senate. That didn't work out so well. But there were not a lot of reporters who could really capture and keep up with Professor Moynihan when they got the opportunity to talk to him in the Senate and go over in detail what Senator Moynihan was working on. And John Alter was one of Pat Moynihan's really favorite reporters, because he would say to me after a conversation with John, and this was the highest compliment you could get from Professor Senator Moynihan. The door would close and John would be gone, and Senator Moynihan would just say, "He gets it. He gets it." And that was the top compliment. So it's a great pleasure and honor for me for Jonathan to be here today. And I know why you're here. I know why on Super Sunday you diverted to here. I understand it completely. This is the closest you're ever going to get to Rachel Maddow. I understand that. I get that. That makes perfect sense to me. I am going to do a quick passage here. And so I was a high school kid watching this history unfold in 1968, and we got to do it on our TVs. You know, I'd be sitting there on the floor in the living room, and my older brothers would be on the sofa, and my parents would be there, would be watching the Democratic Convention in Chicago and watching Mayor Daley get up and yell at Abe Ribicoff when Abe Ribicoff is up at the podium, just scream these anti-Semitic things at Abe Ribicoff. This just stunning drama that was unfolding, including the assassinations, Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, Gene McCarthy's amazing surge in New Hampshire that no one saw coming until it actually happened. And so this is, it's a work of history. Most of what's in this book I did not know until I really had to sit down and study the year and learn it. But a tremendous amount of it is actually eyewitness, an eyewitness account, things that I actually saw, things that I lived through at that time. And so there's a very personal component to it, and I would like to just share a bit of that from the beginning of the book. And this is where we're talking about what everyone was wondering about in 1967, the year before the campaign. Would Bobby Kennedy run for president? And everywhere Bobby Kennedy went, the crowds would chant. This is the year before. They would be chanting, "Run, Bobby, run," everywhere he went. Bobby was a realist, a politician second, and a dreamer third. Let me do that again. Bobby was a realist first, a politician second, and a dreamer third. When he heard his audiences urging him to run for president, he knew he was hearing dreamers. Their dream was not so much another Kennedy presidency as it was the restoration of the first Kennedy presidency. They wanted to put their shattered dream back together. Bobby knew what they wanted was impossible, crazy, maybe even political suicide. Running against the incumbent president for the nomination of his party was madness. Running against Lyndon Johnson for the nomination that he owned was something more than madness. Lyndon Johnson and Richard Nixon, the most ruthless Democrat and the most ruthless Republican, feared that dream of run, Bobby, run. Bobby was almost certain that challenging Johnson was hopeless, but it might be the only way to put pressure on the president to de-escalate the Vietnam War. The chance, the dream, the war, and anti-war Democrats privately urging him to do it all contrived to get Bobby thinking about it. It was a rerun of the way he had approached running for Senate 3 years earlier. At first he resisted, then he wavered, then he resisted again, then he wavered again. All the while, Johnson and Nixon and the others believed that Bobby held history in his hands. Bobby did not yet realize that the 1968 presidential election would be about nothing less than life and death. In the nuclear age, all presidential elections were, by implication at least, about life and death, because the commander-in-chief had the power to start World War III in minutes by launching nuclear missiles. But the 1968 election was going to be about the life and death of people we knew. In the spring of 1967, my cousin John T. Corley Jr. graduated from West Point. He visited us in Boston before he shipped out to Vietnam in 1968. Johnny was the tallest among us, 6 feet 4 inches, a West Point football star. We worried that he would be an easy target in Vietnam. Johnny wasn't worried. He grew up on Army bases with his father, a general, and he was trained for combat and eager to try to rival his father's World War II and Korean War records, which filled their home with 26 combat awards and decorations, including a record-setting 8 Silver Stars. My oldest brother Michael showed Johnny his draft notice, which had just arrived in the mail. Michael was worried. He didn't want to go to Vietnam. No one we knew wanted to go except Johnny. He wanted a career in the Army like his father, and combat was part of that. Johnny advised Michael that the best way to avoid Vietnam might be to voluntarily enlist before being drafted, because then he might get a better choice of assignments. Getting drafted was the fastest route to Vietnam. Michael took Johnny's advice, enlisted, got easy assignments in the Army, and never left the United States. Johnny arrived in Vietnam on May 9th, 1968. Over the course of that summer, his letters to Michael began to question the wisdom of the mission in Vietnam. Johnny earned a Silver Star in 4 months on September 8th, 1968, the day he was killed in action. His funeral was the first military funeral I attended. Tragedy has many faces, but none quite like a general crying, saluting his son's coffin. It was just another day in the life of America in 1968. The presidential election could end all that. If Bobby ran on ending the war in Vietnam and won, as anti-war Democrats were assuring him he could. I was in high school in 1968, and I never heard my brothers and their college-age friends talk about career planning. They only talked about how to deal with the draft and Vietnam. There was no long-term planning, no career hopes and dreams. Life was a short-term game for many young men in 1968. It was as if they were prisoners who would only begin to think about life on the outside when they got outside. Their prison was in their pocket, the draft registration card that controlled their lives and blocked their hopes and dreams. The presidential election could end all that. The presidential election was a matter of life and death for real people we all knew. That meant that this time running for president didn't have to be about ego. It meant running for president couldn't simply be a matter of political calculation. It meant that it wasn't just about what was best for Bobby's future in politics. It was about life and death. The death Bobby thought about was his own. He worried that announcing his candidacy might tempt an assassin. He knew assassination was driven more by madness than logic, and maybe getting the second Kennedy on his way to the presidency would capture an assassin's twisted imagination. He was the only potential candidate who had to worry about a copycat assassin going for another Kennedy. And so Bobby's thinking about running was muddled and slow. He was leaning against running most of the time. As he thought about it, Bobby, who had been the manager of his brother's winning presidential campaign, could see every detail of what could go wrong with his own. But he could not yet see what the election was going to be about: life and death. And so Bobby held history in his hands for so long that someone who could see what the election was going to be about decided he couldn't wait any longer and grabbed history out of Bobby's hands, someone no one expected to seize the moment until he did.
So I want to take you back to what seems in the book is one of sort of the big bangs of the whole 68 year election and reverberations that carried on through even today. And you paint this picture of this Senate hearing in 67. Nicholas Katzenbach of the Johnson administration is arguing that they have the authority to wage war in Southeast Asia, that Congress gave it to them. And one senator walks out in anger and makes a statement, makes a decision in his mind which really changes history.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and that, of course, is Gene McCarthy, who's a member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee at the time. And he stalked out of that hearing quite angrily after hearing the Undersecretary of State say that declarations of war were outmoded. They didn't need any such authority to continue to conduct the Vietnam War in whatever way the president was wanted to. And Gene McCarthy went out of that hearing room enraged, actually, to the point where he decided he couldn't speak in the hearing room. He thought if he did, it would get ugly, and better that he just hold his temper. And so he said to his chief of staff when he left the hearing room, he said, "If I have to run for president to do it, I'm going to do it," by which he meant put the Vietnam War on the ballot, on the presidential ballot, and run as an anti-war candidate. And it was in that hearing room, that moment in that hearing room, that really provoked him more than anything else that in the road that led him to run for president. And what was going on was there was a liberal gadfly named Allard Lowenstein who was going around trying to find an anti-war candidate to run as a Democrat in the primaries to, as he put it, dump Johnson. And of course his first choice was Bobby Kennedy, and Bobby Kennedy turned him down, and then he kept going back to him, and Bobby Kennedy kept turning him down. He eventually went to Gene McCarthy. Gene McCarthy said, "You should go to Kennedy." He said, "Well, I've been to Kennedy." He said, "Well, you should go to George McGovern." He went over to George McGovern. McGovern said, "You should ask McCarthy." And McCarthy really didn't want to do it. He really thought Bobby's the one who should do this. He's the one who can do this, and Bobby didn't. And so the opening was there, and it was Gene McCarthy who seized that moment. And that moment in that Foreign Relations Committee hearing that you're talking about is one of those things that can happen in Senate hearings, that might look incredibly boring to the C-SPAN viewer, but having been sitting back there against the wall in many Senate hearings as a staff member, I can tell you there are moments like that really change the way senators see their jobs, and this was one of those.
Yeah, I mean, talk about LBJ at that moment. You know, he was going to be a shoo-in.
Yeah.
He was unstoppable, not only just because of his character, but just the way the whole thing was structured. So Gene McCarthy saying, "I'm going to take on LBJ," I mean, talk about how preposterous that is.
Well, it was so crazy an idea that Gene McCarthy couldn't even admit to it when he was announcing his campaign. He actually didn't announce that he was running for president. He announced that he was going to run in some primaries, 3, maybe 4 primaries. That was all he was announcing that he was going to do. And when he made that announcement, he didn't think he was going to run in the first one, which was New Hampshire. Changed his mind about that just in time to run in New Hampshire. That's how nutty it was. And running in primaries was not the way to get a presidential nomination. You could run in none of them and still just go to the convention and round up enough delegates from states that didn't have primaries, because most states didn't. And you'd still get the nomination, which ultimately, by the way, is how Hubert Humphrey got the nomination. He didn't run in any primaries. And so there wasn't, McCarthy created in that run in 1968 what was to become a path that would reasonably exist only after he tried it, to unseat an incumbent president on the way to a nomination. And so even though there was no mathematical way you could figure out that he could pull this off at the beginning, he ended up, in effect, dumping Johnson because after Gene McCarthy won New Hampshire, which I have to tell you, when I was in high school, I thought he won New Hampshire because the coverage was so overwhelming about how great McCarthy did in New Hampshire last night. It was literally decades later that I discovered he came in second. But it was, but it was such a strong second. You know, he was supposed to get 4% of the vote, and he got over 40% of the vote against an incumbent president. The media reported that as a giant, giant win, in effect. And so Johnson was knocked off his stride completely by that, as were the establishment Democrats. And then Bobby jumps into the race. Johnson feared that, desperately feared that. And not long after that, Lyndon Johnson just dropped out. Incumbent president just said, I quit. I'm not running for my own re-election nomination, which he still mathematically would have had a lock on if he stayed in.
Yeah, there's so many wonderful details. Talk a little bit about the story that you tell in the book about Jackie Kennedy in the '64 convention. Bobby's going to give this speech, and she slips him the passage from Romeo and Juliet.
Yeah,
it's just wonderful. And put
I,
that into context of what that means for Bobby, for Jack, for Bobby's future run.
Yeah, let me see if I can find that, because it's this amazing quote.
Yeah.
I'm just going to have to read you this from the book, because I don't have Shakespeare memorized the way Jackie Kennedy did. So this is an amazing thing to have discovered, because what happened to Bobby Kennedy at the 1964 convention, which is happening less than a year after his brother was assassinated, was when he walked out onto that stage, it was as if a saint had descended from heaven. It was something that had never before been seen on a political stage. And he then gave a speech that had an element in it that was absolutely unthinkable, and no speechwriter could have come up with it. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to have to go to the book on this, because I want to get it exactly right. On the convention's last night, this is the 1964 convention. It's the Lyndon Johnson convention, and he is very resentful that Bobby Kennedy is getting any attention at all, and he did everything he could to try to minimize the attention that Bobby Kennedy was getting, but it didn't work. On the convention's last night, the Democrats showed a short film honoring JFK. Bobby was scheduled to make a short speech before the film. As he came to the podium, the hall went wild. The applause and cheering went on and on. It wouldn't stop. Television commentators were speechless. No one had ever seen anything like it. Bobby didn't even try to speak. He waited, looking bashful. When he tried to speak, the applause and cheers got louder. 22 minutes, the longest ovation anyone there had ever seen. And Bobby knew it wasn't for him. It was for the assassinated president who should have been there running for his second term. Bobby quoted from Romeo and Juliet, "When he shall die, take him and cut him out into stars, that he shall make the face of heaven so fine that all the world will be in love with night and pay no worship to the garish sun." Then Bobby promised his party he was looking not only to the past, but to the future. The place exploded again. It was the most moving moment ever seen on an American political stage. It was the rawness of the emotion, the intimacy of reverential love, and Bobby's open, nearly shy reading of Shakespeare that made his speech the glory of the convention. Was LBJ the garish sun, unworthy of worship when compared to the face of heaven? Even someone less paranoid than Johnson might have taken that moment as a declaration of war. The truth of what Johnson saw was not something he could comprehend or imagine. It was not the clever trick of a speechwriter trying to poke an opponent. No political speechwriter in 1964 would want their man invoking Juliet's blend of female passion, worship, and yearning. Adding the Juliet passage was not Bobby's idea, it was Jackie's. She had read the speech in draft and at the last minute added the passage. The grieving widow put a female voice in Bobby Kennedy's beatification of Jack Kennedy. She gave Bobby the words that would mythologize Jack and Bobby at the same time.
It's a fantastic story. So G. McCarthy does well. You think he wins New Hampshire. He comes in second. Bobby jumps in the race, says, I can see it now. I hemmed and hawed, but I'm in now. LBJ pulls his hair out. Talk about the Vietnam address that LBJ gives in the Oval Office to the TV cameras, the details that you have about having a secret signal to his wife, having a resignation letter always written. Just talk a little bit about that. And I'm also very curious, do you remember that moment? Where were you?
Oh, remember it vividly. It was the single most shocking moment in a political speech in my lifetime. Now, that's not saying a lot when you really think about it, because shock does not reside in political speeches. That's not what they do. They can thrill you. The Obama 2004 convention speech can impress you and make you think, wow, this guy can go a long way. But shock, really stunned shock, and the most important news of what would have been the most important news of any other year, which was in that case the most important news of the week in 1968. Lyndon Johnson has a long planned speech on Vietnam policy, which has been just impossible for him to figure out, basically because he's going from the principle of, I don't want to be the first president to lose a war. And the problem with that is there was no route to follow in Vietnam that would not end in what he would consider losing a war. So he's trying to find a strategy where there wasn't one. So he came up with a new important Vietnam speech in which he was going to take more steps toward peace negotiating. It would have been a very important speech that year in Vietnam in and of itself. But he had a last line to it that absolutely stopped us all, shocked us all the moment he said it. We all have it memorized for life. I know Jonathan can do it right now. When he got to the end of the speech, he said, because trying to work toward peace in Vietnam is going to take everything I have, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for President of the United States. And my draft age brothers sat there absolutely stunned. People in living rooms around the country screamed in shock and in joy. The Dump Johnson crowd, Allard Lowenstein and the people who'd been working hard to dump Johnson, that was the biggest party night for them of all of 1968. That was the most important thing that happened. And Lyndon did not tell anybody, almost anyone working in the White House, that he was doing this, including his Secretary of State and Secretary of Defense, who thought that they had seen the final version of this speech. Lady Bird knew that he might do this. The First Lady knew that he might do it, and he had a signal set up with her, because it was one of those straight-ahead Oval Office shots, a pretty tight box, and his hands were not in the frame of the shot, and he told her that if he lifts his finger like this before that final paragraph, that means he's going to do it. He's going to drop out. And he gave her the signal, and then he went on with it. And so the people in the White House working for Lyndon Johnson were learning it at the same time that we all learned it.
Let's talk a little about Martin Luther King. At this moment, he sort of has everything on the line. He's taking on LBJ. You write about how he's starting to shift focus over to sort of the oppression of poor people. He's got pressure from radicals in the community. You feel his passiveness and nonviolence is a mistake. His assassination, lands on America, I think, in ways that we can't, or at least younger people who weren't alive then, can even fathom now. I mean, talk about the reverberations of that on top of this already frenetic year.
Well, it's the assassination decade, beginning in 1963 on November 22nd with the president. And so those of us who, were awake enough, I was in elementary school, to live through that permanently, and I mean permanently, lost our ability to be surprised by gigantic and overwhelming tragedy. So when we heard that, Medgar Evers was assassinated, or we heard that Malcolm X was assassinated, and even, we heard that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated. What our inner sensation was that it was happening again. Now, to compare it to, my daughter's comparable experience, 9/11. She was in elementary school for that. No one could feel that it's happening again. That was a unique first-time experience of its kind. And, but this was, by the time you get to Martin Luther King Jr., it had that horrible sensation of it's happening again, and it was not easy to muster surprise about it. Bobby Kennedy was campaigning that day. He got the word in Indiana. He got the word when he got off a plane in Indianapolis. And he was on his way to a campaign event in the middle of the black neighborhood in Indianapolis. He was told by the Indianapolis police, do not go there. We cannot guarantee your safety. In fact, we can't actually send our officers into that neighborhood tonight. We think it would be wiser if we don't, because it could be provocative. Just the sight of police, could spark some kind of rioting reaction. And in fact, rioting did break out all over the country that night, in cities all over the country. Bobby Kennedy said to the police, I'm going to go there. I have no fear at all of my safety there. In fact, he said something about that's where I'm safest in America, is in a neighborhood like that. And he got up in the back of a flatbed truck with a microphone where his campaign event was scheduled. Most people there didn't know that the terrible news about Martin Luther King. And he had to announce it. He didn't want to. In fact, he asked ahead of time, do they know? Do they know? And he was told, no, most of them don't know. Because no one had phones in their pockets, and they hadn't been home in a while because they didn't see TV news. They wanted to be there early for the Kennedy event. They had Kennedy signs. It was a happy crowd, mostly cheering before Bobby Kennedy stood up. And he threw away whatever the speech was going to be and just talked to this crowd and had to inform them about what happened. And it was the first time and only time that he talked in personal terms about the assassination of his brother, saying that he knows what it feels like to lose someone this way. And it was a very short speech. You can find it actually online these days and see it. And Indianapolis was one of the cities in America, one of the few where there was no rioting that night. But the aftermath of the Martin Luther King assassination was, there's no real border that you can put on when does the aftermath of that end. But it certainly froze the presidential campaign functionally for weeks and weeks and weeks after that. And it also changed in a way slightly the dynamics on the Republican side of the campaign, where Richard Nixon actually, his reaction to it was to talk about law and order more than before, because when he was talking about law and order, what everyone understood he meant was, I will crack down on those rioters that you saw in the streets after Martin Luther King Jr.'s assassination. And so just that, the King assassination in any other presidential campaign year would have been the single biggest event of the campaign year, even though he wasn't a candidate. The way it interacted with the campaign. And in 1968, it was, one of the two assassinations of that year.
What was the most searing detail that you came across on the Robert Kennedy assassination? I mean, you and folks that haven't read it yet, we're going to just be taken through sort of the hours and the meal in the hotel room and meeting a waiter and all these details about if Bobby had left the stage one direction or not the other. I mean, just what jumped out at you that was new to you that kind of moved you on that story?
Well, yeah, I discovered Juan Romero about, 4 or 5 years ago. And he is the waiter who you will see in the world-famous picture, who's on the floor holding up Bobby Kennedy's head after he's been shot. And Juan Romero was a high school kid in LA who had a part-time job as a room service waiter at the hotel. And he had served the room service dinner that night to Bobby Kennedy and his wife, Ethel, who was with Andy Williams, the singer, and his wife, a dinner for 4 in the room. And the way I discovered Juan Romero literally was in my local newspaper, the Los Angeles Times. I think it was a Friday. Great columnist there, Steve Lopez, had tracked him down and found him. And he'd only spoken to a reporter once before in his life. And so Steve Lopez got all these details out of Juan Romero about that night that had not been known before. And so he normally would have gone home. His shift was over, but Juan Romero wanted to see Bobby Kennedy in that winning moment. And one of the things that the ballroom included were not just all the Kennedy supporters, but the kitchen staff they all just came out of the kitchen and were standing along the sidelines to see this. They wanted to see this. And Bobby Kennedy was originally scheduled to walk off this side of the stage with Ethel Kennedy, who was on this side of the stage, and head for the car. Instead, at the last minute, there was a change for him to walk off this side of the stage to go toward the kitchen because there were some reporters there that he was supposed to talk to on his way out. And Sirhan was standing over there. And so, if he had gone this way. And it's, the burden, Bobby Kennedy had the biggest advantage of any presidential candidate in history, and that was to run basically as the inheritor of his assassinated brother's presidency. That was a tremendous advantage and a tremendous emotional advantage. It was also the single biggest burden that any presidential candidate had ever had. And in the end, it was no doubt the thing that pulled Sirhan to get this candidate and no other. That this was the person who he wanted. And so Bobby Kennedy, when he thought about running, was worried about this. And it's fascinating to me that his wife, Ethel Kennedy, urged him to run. Doubly fascinating that Jackie Kennedy urged him to run. And then, confoundingly fascinating when you discover that after Bobby announced that he was running, Jackie Kennedy said to a dear friend of hers, "You know what's going to happen to Bobby?" And there was a pause, and she said the same thing that happened to Jack.
Richard Nixon, and maybe the first story you tell in the book. It's a story that we're still, I think, living through
with
today.
Living with it today.
Tell us about Richard Nixon, Roger Ailes.
So it's no accident that in the very first sentence of the book, Richard Nixon meets Roger Ailes in a makeup chair, since politics is so much about show business. And so Roger Ailes was working in entertainment at the time, and the Mike Douglas show, sort of the Ellen DeGeneres show of its day, with less talent. And so Nixon, is complaining to Ailes. It's 1967. He's gearing up for his 1968 presidential campaign, and he's complaining to Ailes about, why am I doing this silly kind of TV when I should just be doing the adult stuff like Meet the Press? Ailes goes on for a minimum of 10 minutes telling Nixon everything he's gotten wrong about television, everything he doesn't understand about television. And Ailes is really like a little, angry about this, that you don't understand television, and that's why you lost in 1960 and all this stuff. And Nixon loves it, because no one talks to the former vice president like this, and he thinks, wow, this guy really knows television, and he really knows what politics means in television and how to make it work. So he invites Roger Ailes into his presidential campaign and thereby ruins America. So Roger Ailes, who is a relatively small player in 1968, but a vitally important player because he is part of the Nixon television strategy. And television is what Nixon got wrong when he lost the presidency in 1960. In 1960, Richard Nixon became the very first vice president in history to lose a presidential election. And he did that because he didn't understand TV. Nixon won in 1968 by less than 1% of the vote. So if you change any little thing in the Nixon campaign, he loses. If you pull Roger Ailes out, he loses. Roger Ailes helped perfect a Nixon TV strategy that then infected our politics ever since and has been part of the TV ad style of politics ever since. Nixon goes on to get elected president twice and then is driven out of town, you know, on the eve of impeachment. And Nixon's legacy is zero. There is no Nixonism that survives him. There's nothing that lives after Nixon in our politics. But Roger Ailes lives after Nixon. And Roger Ailes helps elect the next Republican president, Ronald Reagan. He helps re-elect Ronald Reagan. He helps elect George H.W. Bush. He then leaves politics formally and joins political TV. Rupert Murdoch in 1996 has Roger Ailes create for him the Fox News network, which is determined from the outset to be Republican supporting TV. Roger Ailes does that. He helps elect, if you can call it that, George W. Bush in 2000. He helps re-elect him in 2004. Fox News, you know, buoys up everything on the Republican side of our politics, and without Fox News, we would have a different president today. So Roger Ailes meeting Nixon in that makeup chair in 1968 has given you the thing you're trying not to think about today.
I think this crowd is going to ask some questions, so I just have one more, keeping with the TV theme, the Chicago Convention. Were you watching when Daley barrages Abe Ribicoff with slurs and curse words? Did you know what he was saying?
Yeah, because they had lip readers on network TV within the hour. Because Daley wasn't mic'd, right? Like I have a mic, that's why you can hear me, right? But so Abe Ribicoff's up at the podium and he's got the mic of the podium, and Abe Ribicoff at this point is doing a last-ditch endorsement of George McGovern, which is a hopeless candidacy that's being floated at the convention. And Abe Ribicoff says, if George McGovern were president, we wouldn't have, you know, these Gestapo tactics on the streets of Chicago tonight. The mayor of Chicago jumps out of his seat and starts screaming at Abe Ribicoff, this distinguished gentleman from Connecticut, one of the most, you know, respected and dignified men in the United States Senate, starts screaming this anti-Semitic stuff at him with all the profanity that you could imagine just flying at him, and Ribicoff, you know, stares him down and keeps going. And yeah, I mean, the networks all cut to the mayor, and it was a good shot. You could see what he was saying, and you know, everybody knew what he was saying even before the lip readers got on there and gave us all the details of it. And again, you know, that moment in any other presidential convention would have been by far the biggest moment of the presidential convention, or both presidential conventions. It was just Wednesday night. In that convention. That's really all it was, because it was so wildly out of control. You know, Mike Wallace getting punches thrown at him on the floor of the convention, Dan Rather getting punches thrown at him on the floor of the convention as reporters. There was rioting inside the convention hall, which was, you know, calm compared to the rioting outside of the convention hall. And so, yeah, and that's why, you know, in the writing of this, you know, I had a couple of people helping me with research, including Christina, who's here somewhere. And I would say things like, you know, there's the moment where Daley gets up and yells, and I think it's Ribicoff. I'm almost sure it's Ribicoff. I know it's a Jewish senator because I know what he said, and it's got to be Ribicoff. You know, and then they'd find it, and they'd have the YouTube video for me, and I'd look at it, and it was really like, oh yeah, this was last night. It was like I remember that from last night, because the imagery of all of that was so vivid and so one-off. You know, I never saw the mayor in any other convention city get up and scream anti-Semitic stuff at one of the senators speaking. Like, you don't have that memory from any other convention. So these memories are they're not battling for space in your brain, you know, from the other campaign years, because there's nothing like this in any of the other campaign years.
All right, just one last question. In Donald Trump's acceptance speech at the RNC, he said, "Images of violence in our streets and the chaos in our communities," painting this picture of chaos in the streets. He mentions law and order 4 times. Mm-hmm. Talk about sort of the genesis of that mantra, and then bring it all the way to today, where Trump, who ran with this, now is turned on the Justice Department, the FBI, and is critical. So how has this been a consistent thing until now where it's being turned?
I don't know if I can do the last part of that, because it's such a magic trick that it's hard to follow. But yeah, so you know, George Wallace basically loses the battle for segregation forever, which is what he ran on for governor of Alabama. He was a segregationist and said, you know, segregation now, segregation forever. The courts beat him on that. So and the Kennedy administration sent Nick Katzenbach, then the Deputy Attorney General, down to Alabama to, in effect, forcibly integrate the University of Alabama. So the segregationists got steamrolled, you know, by the Constitution and the federal government in the early 1960s. So by the time you get to 1968, and segregationist George Wallace is running for president, he says to reporters, "I don't talk about segregation anymore, I talk about law and order." And what's important about that is every Wallace voter always knew what Wallace was talking about. When he says law and order, they knew what that meant. That meant, I will give you everything that segregationists want, but I might not be able to give you the strict legalized segregation that we used to have, but I will give you everything else. And so Nixon picks up on this Wallace phrase, law and order, because Nixon's big problem was, you know, George Wallace is running as a third party. He might pull, you know, southern states out of the Electoral College that would otherwise go to Nixon. So Nixon tries to sound as much like George Wallace as he can, and law and order is a great phrase for him to use. And so he works that law and order phrase pretty hard. And as you've seen, every single Republican who runs for president always works the law and order phrase pretty much as hard as they can. And it's always been the same message, and it's always been understood exactly where it needs to be understood, which is in all the formerly segregationist, legally segregated states of the South. They know exactly what you're talking about. And in fact, George Wallace's campaign manager told me that when he listened to Donald Trump campaign for president, he was hearing George Wallace. All the language was so similar, the way he dealt with crowds was similar. Wallace used to love to have hecklers in the audience, especially, you know, those hippie, pinko commies that he could yell at, because what Wallace would do is he'd yell right back at them when they'd start yelling at him. And what Wallace understood, every other politician would be horrified. Oh, my staged event is being disrupted by protesters. And Wallace loved it, because he knew that when he yells back at those communists, when he, you know, fights back with them at this microphone, his audience is seeing who his enemies are. And he is showing his supporters, this is what I will do to your enemies. I hate those people as much as you hate those people. You cut to 2016, you have a presidential candidate standing at a microphone saying, I'd like to punch him in the mouth, when they're dragging a protester out of a Trump event. Tom Turnipseed, who was George Wallace's campaign manager, said that it was just eerie for him, that it was just, you know, that he was just watching Wallace on a stage again. Parenthetically, Tom Turnipseed was, like everyone in America in the 1960s, evolving some whether we knew it or not. So there was Tom Turnipseed in the early 1960s, an absolute segregationist, just like George Wallace. 1968, he's running the campaign of the candidate who's trying to hold on to whatever we can of segregation. And by the end of the 1970s, Tom Turnipseed is a civil rights lawyer. And he goes on to what becomes another career as a strong, liberal civil rights lawyer in Alabama, because he lived a life that took him through that kind of enlightenment to the other side of that. And everyone was going through that to some degree, especially in that period. There were people, no one in 1969 thought the same thing that they thought in 1961 about everything, but certainly about a lot of things. But everyone's mind changed about an awful lot of things, and that's true of especially the Democratic candidates in this book. You see Gene McCarthy change over time. You see Bobby Kennedy change over time, because they are very much a part of that time when so much is changing underneath them, and they are actively trying to pay attention to what's changing underneath them and to understand it, and to figure out their place in it. And unfortunately, that's not what was happening on the Republican side.
Okay, I think we.
Could we stop there because it's hopeful?
Yeah. Open it. Do you want to open up for questions or?
Please raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. Just start in the front.
Should I stand? Oh, thank you, Lawrence O'Donnell, and I also thank Keith Overman, you and him really getting MSNBC up and started.
There's one thing you should know about where you're sitting.
What?
You have a very special seat as a Keith Olbermann fan.
Okay.
Because we, the men in makeup, are nothing without the people who actually create and put our shows on television, okay? And sitting beside you is Isabella Povich,
Oh, okay.
who created Keith Olbermann's show on MSNBC. And and Izzy Povich created The Last Word with Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC. There would be no show. You would not know Keith Olbermann or me were it not for Izzy Povich. Anyway, go ahead. And she's a Montclair resident, by the way.
I tune into you almost every night. I get up really early, and I say to myself, okay, I got to come here and hear you, and I got to respond to some of the things you're saying, which, again, I'm like 100%, I agree with you most of the time. But you said something about Fox TV, or Fox News, and you said that they were the network to help propel Donald Trump to office. I only take exception with that most of all the networks did this because he was seen as a cash cow with viewership. And not only that, but I understand, I don't want to mix this up too much, but anyway, I understand that when you have that much viewership and networks are saying, oh, it's a cash cow, people are shocked to hear some of those things that's coming out of his mouth, but he's also letting those people vent. And basically, where it's a responsibility of the networks to see, hold on for a second, this guy's going against all the norms of our society that we're trying to build. If we look at the past 8 years that Obama was in office, he is the first president that really said, listen, we're going to bring this, he's brought this economy back. He helped, hold on, I'm going to get to my question. But my question was.
So far, we agree.
But my question is that, do you think that all the networks have a responsibility to deal with candidates that might be similar to a Donald Trump after he leaves office? This to say that, you can't let this rhetoric of this one individual get out of control where you can shape and reshape our whole society and the institutions of our society.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. I think the news media failed miserably on the Trump campaign all the way through. One of the trick questions of the 2016 campaign would be, what was the best Donald Trump interview? And the answer is the campaign. During the presidency, obviously, it was Lester Holt who got him to confess to a crime. That's a whole different thing. But during the campaign. And the answer is there really isn't one. Because, the best you'd have is in a 1-hour interview, there'd be one question. that was illuminating. That would be the maximum in a Trump interview. And one of the reasons for that is the mission, the television mission of every televised Trump interviewer was to get the next Trump interview. Think about that. How tough is that interview going to be? So I never got a Trump interview. Rachel Maddow never got a Trump interview. Okay, so when people say he did interviews with everyone, he did not. He did not dare do interviews that he knew ahead of time would be tough from start to finish. He never did one of those. And every other televised interview was in the business of getting him to come back for another one because those interviews were very, very good for ratings. And so I had to run a show, and Rachel had to run a show that was never going to get the ratings bump of a Trump interview. But I think, the news media has slowly, sadly, learned, for the most part, how to deal with Trump now that he's president. But I wish the people who are tough on him now understood what they were dealing with during the campaign year. And by the way, he made it very clear years before that. I mean, I called him a liar the first time he opened his mouth about the president's birth certificate. And I never called him anything but a liar about the president's birth certificate. And no one else did. No one else did, because you don't use the word lie in the news business. So Trump saw all these polite conventions that this business was working within, and he saw them like, oh, they don't call a lie. That's great for me. And he just jumped in and exploited all of that.
Okay, next. Over here, I'm going to just start on the far side. Excuse me.
Lawrence, we watch you every night. My wife religiously watches you after Rachel. But
Great.
what I watch is Chris Matthews, too. Now, his book was about Robert Kennedy. We bought yours tonight. I got started in '68 when I was 21 as a Robert Kennedy supporter at Rutgers Newark, Students for Kennedy. And I'm still waiting, as many of us are, for the restoration. And I noticed your comments the other night on the program after the State of the Union. I need you to elaborate a little, because you weren't as positive as everybody else was about Joe Kennedy III. Now, we look at him as maybe the one that could come back, because so many other Kennedy family members have failed. They actually have failed to come back, all the other children. Can you tell us, I was elected mayor here about 12 years ago, 15 years ago. Then I was defeated, but I learned all my techniques from the Kennedys. But then I did lose, because Montclair never reelects a mayor usually. But it's a tough town to be a mayor in, and I left you a note out here about your book. You'll get my note. But we really love your comments. But the Kennedy III, Joe Kennedy III comment, please elaborate on that, because you said he didn't, Bobby would have said something different. That's what you said that night. I wanted to know what you meant.
Yeah, there's two things that Bobby Kennedy wouldn't have done. But, this is a really tricky thing to try to do, because now you have to imagine Bobby Kennedy in 2018. So he'd be different. He would have moved on everything and moved on all of the issues. But one thing that he was always hyper aware of was the need to be heard by more than one faction of his support. And that's a very difficult thing for liberal Democrats to do. So, it is possible to, and Bobby Kennedy had a way of doing this. It is possible on the same day to speak to an impoverished population in an inner city that has been the subject of racial prejudice for hundreds of years, and to connect with them. And it is possible to connect with police officers and firefighters in the same town on the same day without changing anything about any positions or anything like that. And he was pretty careful about that. And in 1968, by the way, especially after the Martin Luther King assassination, Bobby Kennedy reminded people, he more frequently would remind his audiences, especially as the campaign moved into certain states, that he was indeed the former top law enforcement official in the United States, the former Attorney General, and Bobby Kennedy would use the phrase law and order. Now, he would use that phrase in a way that didn't carry all the baggage that Nixon intended it to carry, but he very, very deliberately intended to not cede that ground to Nixon. He wasn't going to play on the other side of that line. And you now, with Democrats and Republicans now, there's very little shared language or shared concepts. And so which is to say, there are very few of them, if any, who know how to change votes. So, and that's the job. The job is to identify with a good, solid, 43% of the public that is always going to vote Democratic no matter what, or always vote Republican no matter what. And then the remainder of the job is to get 9% or so who could vote either way or who have voted for Republicans. And so, you have to have a language and a style that can be heard by the other side. And Bobby Kennedy was really good at that, actually. He was really good at he knew what the other side was thinking, and he thought about what the other side was thinking. And I don't know Joe Kennedy. I don't know his grandson at all. I've never met him. I've never talked to him. I could have warned him about that lip gloss thing. I'm telling you, it's a TV makeup thing. They always give you too much of that. They always do. And you've got to have a little Kleenex. They always overdo it. Yeah, I could have warned him about that. But look, I read some of the excerpts of Joe Kennedy's speech before he gave it, and I thought, oh God, this is just boring Democratic Party talking points. And then I saw him give the speech. I went, oh, that's pretty good. So that really impressed me, that he could take something that read relatively lifeless to me and invest it with real human feeling, and that is the Kennedy touch. That really is his grandfather's touch, so we'll see. Yeah.
Hi, how are you? My friend just said, oh, here we go. I'm scared, and I've been scared for some time with the state of our union. Can our union survive after this administration? What's happened to the good Republicans and also the religious right? Why have they just caved in to destroying our country and our laws?
The only thing that I'm scared about is a nuclear exchange with North Korea. That's the only thing you can't undo. The tax rates are going to change again. Everybody here who got an income tax rate cut, I promise you we'll get it back up there. We'll get it back up to that 39.6, which is the one that I worked on the tax. That's when we put it up to that rate in 1993, first year of the Clinton presidency. I was in the Senate Finance Committee, and we got that rate up there. And I'm not sure we're going to get the deductibility of your state and local taxes back, but everything they did in tax legislation, obviously, it all gets undone all the time. The tax cuts get undone, the tax increases get undone. That's the way it works. That's all repairable. The nuclear exchange is not repairable, and that's the only thing that I actually worry about. The other thing that you're talking about is something where, it's as if we are on a roller coaster ride in the dark, and we do not know if this thing's going to stop. We don't know if it's going to go off the rails. What makes everything so suspenseful in this investigation is we know that this president doesn't care about anything that any previous president has cared about, including what Richard Nixon cared about. I mean, Richard Nixon, when it came down to it, when given an order by the United States Supreme Court, he just could not imagine his way out of that. He could not imagine refusing that order to hand over those tapes. This guy would take the tapes out onto the lawn and burn them while the U.S. Marshal is being kept outside of the White House gate trying to serve the subpoena on the tapes. And you know, Nixon was a lawyer, and he was a pretty smart one. He was a really smart kid. You know, he went to Duke Law School. He actually got admitted to Harvard College, but he couldn't go there. Harvard was prepared to give him a full scholarship, but the problem in the Nixon family was they were so impoverished back in his corner of Southern California that if he left town, he was worried about, you know, how his mother and his father would survive, because he helped them, you know, and earn an income. And so he's a very smart guy, Nixon, and he couldn't imagine the things that Trump can imagine. There's a real danger in ignorance. There's a real danger in how deep and profound and relentless Donald Trump's ignorance is, because it allows him to imagine anything, you know. And so if, you know, refuses to, you know, meet with Mueller for an interview, and then they subpoena him to testify to a grand jury, he may simply refuse to comply with the subpoena, and then literally, you know, the method that we have in America for that, if you refuse to show up for that, is we send U.S. Marshals to get you and physically get you and take you out of your home. We don't have a method for doing that with a guy behind a locked gate within which is the White House. We don't know how to do that. And I don't know if you've noticed this, but I keep asking this question on my show from experienced prosecutors, and what if he doesn't, what if he doesn't? And all of them, you'll notice, assume that he will. They assume away the end point of my thing, and I'm just letting that go because no one really has an answer. But that's what we mean by this phrase, constitutional crisis, that the judicial branch of the government could seriously be standing at the gate at Pennsylvania Avenue, which is locked by the Secret Service. And the Secret Service is not allowing in the judicial branch of the government to serve this process on the occupant of that house. Therefore, the Constitution is blocked from doing its job. I don't know what happens then. Here's the biggest thing is Donald Trump doesn't care what happens. And that's the big danger of this whole thing, is that he absolutely does not care about any of that. This other question is another one that I keep asking, and I don't know the answer to, is, you know, why do Republicans go along with this? Why does Paul Ryan go along? Why do these people go along with it? You know, it could be one of those things that's simpler than we think, in that there are kind of moments of truth about where you stand in certain things. You know, I mean, one of the kind of academic skills moments of truth is the SATs, right? It's like you can think you're pretty sharp, and then you go take the SATs, and you go, oh, okay, well, I guess there's a lot more math to learn. Or, you know, and this is one of those tests. And I think we are simply discovering, this might be the explanation, we are simply discovering who these people are. I mean, I knew Paul Ryan wanted to cut taxes in whatever's the lowest possible way. I knew he wanted to cut government spending in every way that he could. I knew that he wanted to repeal Medicare as we know it, and repeal Medicaid and Social Security as we know. I knew all those things. It never concerned me very much because I knew those kinds of things could never get through the legislative process. But it turns out that Paul Ryan, and I use him because he's a kind of, not just a typical Republican House member. He is formally one of the most respected Republican House members in the current crop of Republican House members. Now, if you take this back to when I was working in Congress, he would be among the least respected. But that's how things have changed. We have to deal with who's there now. And it may just be that what we're learning about the people who are there now is that they, as kids, basically, most of them in their age, learned to hate government when Ronald Reagan was campaigning and, you know, doing all this anti-government speech making that he was doing. Reagan himself was actually a reasonable man of government. When David Stockman would present him with his budget options, here's the Department of Agriculture, you can cut it 10%, you can increase it 5%, which they would like, or you can leave it the same. Here's what happens if you cut it 10%. He'd listen to that. And he'd go, okay, keep it the same. And that was what he did on every single budget item presented to him. Like he was not trying to cut this government, down to nothing, but his rhetoric was. And Paul Ryan and all those kids, in high school were learning their hatred of government through a kind of Reagan rhetoric, which Reagan didn't mean, and they apparently believe. And so when we talk about defending institutions and defending the integrity of institutions of government, I don't think that they know what we're talking about. And if they do, I don't think they care about it in the least, including the so-called integrity of the House of Representatives. I think they think, my impression is, that they think government is a cesspool. The House of Representatives itself is a cesspool. That there's nothing honorable here. There never has been. There's no such thing as an honorable process. So, whether we should release this memo or that memo, or there's no issue of honor or sensible operation of the House that appears to come to their minds. And so, if you are the party that for 50 years runs against government, you run for government office against government, and you win some more, and then you get an abject ignoramus as president who has accidentally fallen into your party, and that person is completely out of control. What is it exactly? What is it exactly about you as a person, that would make you rise up on a point of principle? What principle? Against this person, who is a creature of this relentless campaign against government that you have been waging for decades. He is the fruit of that tree. Trump is the fruit of that tree. Trump rages against government, rages against regulation. And so that anti-government rhetoric, which I think a lot of us could have just sort of ignored as it's just a debating point. And by the way, it was. The Bushes never believed that stuff. They never believed any of that stuff. They believed that if you wanted a 10-cent increase in the gasoline tax, maybe we can hold it down to 5 cents. Or maybe 3, or maybe we can do something else other than raise a gasoline tax. They didn't think, that even talking about an increase in the gasoline tax was un-American or something, the way these people do. All I can imagine, and I'm sorry to be so wordy about this, because it is the most perplexing thing that we're looking at. All I can imagine is that if you grow up being taught that government's the enemy, and then you occupy the offices of government, you will not be government's custodians.
And number 3, if you want to get anything done, you have to find a way to pay for it. But I think in this polarized situation, from my observation, I want to ask you, do those rules even apply anymore? Do they even matter?
Yeah, those are exactly the rules. That's the best summary of the rules that I've ever heard. And that certainly is the way it was for me right up through the mid-90s, working in government. And all of those are gone. You don't have to pay for anything. They just exploded the deficit and the debt in the most enormous and willful way possible, with those tax cuts. And they're going to do it some more. They're going to do more things that will increase the deficit and the debt. So they don't care about that. They don't care about, and they also no longer care about anything that requires the cooperation of the other side. So as you know, through reconciliation procedures, you can do everything you want to do in taxation without the other side, and they did, and that's all they care about. They don't really care about anything else. So the Republicans don't pay the slightest attention to what the other side is thinking or what the other side wants. I mean, I used to think about that all the time, just all the time. We did in my time exactly one important piece of legislation with no Republican votes. We did that once in my entire time there. All the rest of the time, I was working on picking up Republicans, and oh, by the way, losing some Democrats. I would lose Sam Nunn, Democrat of Georgia, and I would pick up John Chafee, Republican of Rhode Island. And I almost never would get Sam Nunn on the stuff we were doing, and I'd almost always have John Chafee on the stuff we were doing. And we were doing that all the time. And, and Bob Dole was the Republican leader when I was there, and he was a wonderfully cooperative person to work with. He understood the professionalism of it, including the time he said to me on that vote where we did it with only Democrats, he said to me, you're not going to get any Republican votes. He told me that privately, which was the second best thing he could tell me. Because what it meant was, don't waste your time trying to get Chafee and Danforth and those guys you usually pick off. They won't be available. That was strategically very helpful for me. And he knew it when he told me you won't get any Republican votes. And it was done in a very friendly way. And we got our 51 Democrats and did it. But all of that's gone. Everything you just described is gone. And it's why, by the way, I can have no nostalgia about my job in the Senate, because it doesn't exist anymore. I feel so sorry. My job title is there, staff director of the Senate Finance Committee, staff director of the Committee on Environment and Public Works. Those jobs I had are there, but they don't do them. There's no real governing being done in those committees, and it's not being done the way we used to do it. And so they get the offices and they get the paycheck, but they just are sitting there in these, partisan, shops where they ignore each other. And I just don't see where the turn in the road is. And that has, by the way, that pre-existed Trump, right? So that's the problem with it, is that everything we just described pre-existed Trump for the last few years. So I don't know how they pull out of that.
Okay. Time for one more question up here.
Lawrence, we watch your show every night, and we love it. What I want to say is, with the current mood in Congress that you've described, when the Mueller report hypothetically comes out, and they allude to obstruction of justice, and they find some collusion with the Russians, with some of his staff and people, do you think that Congress would move ahead with impeachment?
It seems as if this Congress, as it's currently constituted, would not. But we'll see what happens with the 2018 elections. I mean, that will tell us, whether that happens or not. This kind of thing used to be so predictable. Let's go back to our last impeachment. We are lucky enough, some of us in this room, to have lived through two of these processes. The Nixon one, which stopped short because he resigned, and then the Bill Clinton one. So the day comes when the news breaks, breaking news. The president apparently has had some kind of liaison with an intern. I will never forget that day of breaking news. I had to go to MSNBC and talk about this thing live. I was in LA and I had to go to the LA studio, talk about it live. Before I leave my house, they've broken into the big networks with this because it's gigantic. It's not just cable news. So ABC, NBC, CBS are covering it. George Stephanopoulos, ABC News, political commentator, is on ABC. George Stephanopoulos has his position in that world because he had become a very famous staff person in the Clinton White House. And so he actually has his position at ABC News because of his Clinton White House affiliation and the fame gained therefrom. And the very first person on that first day when Bill Clinton said, "I did not have sex with that woman," the very first person to use the word impeachment that day was George Stephanopoulos. And I heard him say impeachment. This could lead to impeachment before I left my house to go over to MSNBC. And I thought, whoa, he's right. And he wasn't saying it maliciously. He was just saying it like a meteorologist looking at this, storm over the Azores and how it's going to track through the Caribbean, and South Carolina's right there. And so it's just a professional assessment of the size of the breaking news that we were suddenly wrestling with. George Stephanopoulos said this could lead to impeachment, and he was exactly right, and it did lead to impeachment. And I give you that example only to say how flawlessly predictable politics used to be. It used to be like meteorology in San Diego. It's going to be 86 and sunny tomorrow. And tomorrow and the next day. It was the easiest thing in the world to predict. It was a set of relatively unimaginative minds, because everything worked within a very narrow set of behavioral corridors. And if X happens, Y happens. President, sex with the interns, impeachment. That's what it was. Now, President, $130,000 to Stormy Daniels, and the only suspense is, what will the First Lady wear to the State of the Union? Right? That's the only suspense that comes out of that. And so the predictability of all of this has become completely unmoored. And I always used to crave this, actually. It used to bore me to be the weatherman in San Diego. I wanted to be the weatherman in Maine. I wanted some complicated stuff to deal with. I wanted politics to surprise me. It's gone too far. Okay, I didn't mean this. I'm very sorry that I got that part of my wish. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you two gentlemen for a wonderful conversation.